When it comes to the application of the 10 words to our lives today, I think the Sabbath has to be the most controversial. I mean, what in the world are New Testament Christians supposed to do with this word about observing a 24-hour period? Do we really have to stop? Do we really have to rest once a week? I mean, what do we do with all of Jesus's words about the Sabbath? I think those are good questions, but I'm not sure that they're the place to start. I think the place to start is in the Old Testament when we first read about the Sabbath. And so, Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, if you remember, this is the second time that the 10 words have actually been given to the people of Israel. The first time it happened was back in Exodus chapter 20. And what's interesting is in Exodus chapter 20, God tells the people what they're supposed to do, and then he says this, remember the Sabbath. Now, why does he tell them to remember the Sabbath? Well, I think it's because they're prone to forget it. Having just come out of the land of Egypt, God is interested in giving these newly freed Israelites a new identity and a new calendar, and the Sabbath sort of seems to do both. It teaches them that there are 6 days that they'll work, and then they'll rest on the seventh, and then they'll just do that again and again and again. They need to make sure that they remember the Sabbath. But now, here we are in Deuteronomy chapter 5. 40 years in the wilderness, the people have been stopping once every week. And so it's only at this point in Deuteronomy chapter 5 when we get the 10 words that God gives them this instruction. It's word number 4, and this is what he says. Guard the Sabbath. It's interesting that he doesn't tell them to remember it, but instead he just tells them to guard it. Here's the reason why, in my opinion. Right here on the edge of the promised land, the people are about to experience more abundance than they've ever seen before. As we talked about before, they're going to live in houses that they did not build. They're going to eat from vineyards that they did not cultivate. They're going to enjoy the produce of trees that they did not plant. And there, in the abundance of the land, they may begin to think, you know what? We're pretty awesome. We're pretty cool. We did this ourselves. We brought ourselves up out of the land of Egypt. We've given ourselves this land. And so what God says is, no, you guard that you don't forget what has happened before. The Sabbath day, in some ways, becomes this day that they might remember the realities of what they experienced before. In light of the serious privilege that they're going to experience in the land, do not forget, Moses says, that you were once slaves in the land of Egypt. The Sabbath is supposed to be this day that sort of guards them from this greedy heart, from a heart that would turn away from their neighbor. Instead, it moves them to remember what's important just on this day. This becomes a major problem in the nation of Israel. Several centuries later, the prophet Amos stands up in Amos chapter 8, and he laments. This is what he says. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we may offer wheat for sale? And then they go on to talk about how what they want to do is actually, they want to cheat people. They want to make a profit. And so in Amos chapter 8, what you have is this sort of call to remember the real reason for the Sabbath. Don't begin to abuse the Sabbath anymore, but really remember where you have come from and remember what God is going to do even in your midst. And so Moses, right here in Deuteronomy, is trying to warn them against this attitude that we see. Listen to what the Sabbath word says in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Guard the Sabbath day, or observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You know, it's really interesting. If you compare this word with the word from Exodus chapter 20, what you find is there's more changes with the word about the Sabbath than any other one. One of the changes It adds in ox and donkey here. I find that fascinating. And then it goes on to say, so that your male servant and female servant may rest just like you. In other words, it seems to be, make sure that you allow your Sabbath rest to sort of permeate out into the rest of the people who live within your household, even unto the animals. This day, this one day of observance should help you remember that you are not the center of the universe. Instead, God has called you out of slavery into this good land, and he has given this to you as a gift. You remember him on this day. But notice how it goes on. He then says, you shall remember, there's our remember word, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So first, you guard the day by protecting people's rights. And then you remember the God who rescued you in the first place. In fact, it's almost as if Moses is saying, your observance of Sabbath should lead you to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. I find it really interesting that several centuries later, after Moses' words, Isaiah stands up and he challenges the people who have turned away from God in Isaiah chapter 56. Here, what Isaiah says to the people is this. Isaiah 56. Thus says the Lord, keep justice and do righteousness. For soon my salvation will come and my righteousness will be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. What in the world does Sabbath observance have to do with justice and righteousness and guarding against evil? I think Moses would say everything. So how does this play out within the book of Deuteronomy? If our words in Deuteronomy 5 are connected to other sections of the book, what does that look like? Well, here I think it actually plays out in Deuteronomy 14 and 15. This section is actually a difficult one for us, coming from our cultural perspective. It's really difficult for us to understand why God would have allowed for something in Deuteronomy 15 like slavery, especially in light of some of the abuses that we saw here in America in the 1700s and 1800s. But I think what's helpful for us is to remember that slavery in America was not slavery in the ancient world. Oftentimes, people maintained their status as individuals and their rights, even as they entered into service of another individual. Here's why I think this is important. If we ask the question of Deuteronomy, why was slavery not abolished? I think we're going to find ourselves frustrated. Instead, I think it's better for us to really wrestle with the question, why did God give this instruction here in this place? Here's how Roy Gain talks about sort of slavery and these institutions in the Old Testament. He says, social justice measures in Old Testament law had the purpose of preserving the status quo by maintaining and restoring the pre-existing socioeconomic opportunities of individuals so that they could receive what was reasonably due to them when they fulfilled their expected roles within the society as it was. In other words, the idea is we maintain and restore within the Old Testament law. And so God is not interested, it seems at this point, in completely overturning the whole social order, but rather in making sure that people do not get lowered into lower levels of service and making sure that they can find ways to be restored themselves. I think we'll start to see this as we look at some of these texts. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22, I think is a helpful place to start. Here, the question of the tithe comes up. You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year. And so this is the first point. Make sure you bring part of your harvest every year and you give it to God. In fact, you're supposed to eat it in his presence. And it even goes on to say that when you eat it in his presence, you should rejoice. Verse 26, rejoice, you and your household. Remember all of those people we talked about and the word about the Sabbath? Yes, all of them. You all rejoice together. But then it goes on. At the end of every 3 years, you're also going to share with the disadvantaged so that they can come and enjoy it too. And the purpose of all of this is so that the Lord will bless you. In other words, the promise of blessing is what motivates my generosity. God is so eager for his people to fully trust him that they discard of any fear that would make them feel stingy. I mean, do you hear the echoes here of the word about the Sabbath? That you allow the day to do something within you that changes your heart. Now, things get real in chapter 15. Here, we begin to talk about serious financial implications, and this is what it says. Every 7 years, you will grant a release. Chapter 15, verse 1. In verse 2, this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He will not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. In other words, at the end of every 7 years, you are supposed to give back to people whatever they have borrowed from you. Even the pledge of money to be returned, that is forgiven at this specific year. Now, here's the deal. If an Israelite is really poor, they can't afford anything at all. If they can't even afford to stay alive, God allows a way for them to sell themselves into someone else's service. They allow for someone else to buy them. However, at the end of 7 years, at the end of this time, the one who owns them now must let them go. And they must let them go with this gift of abundance. It's almost as if God seems to care about the disadvantaged. And he frequently calls on those with abundance to take care of the disadvantaged. And he hinges all of this on this crazy, this wild promise. If you do this, I will bless you. Do you see a connection between these observances and the every seventh day Sabbath? The every seventh year release and the every seventh day Sabbath. And I think the principle is this. By stopping and resting, you are forced to place your unknown future into the hands of a known God. Sounds a little like Corrie ten Boom. You have to rely on him to bless you and give you what you need. At the same time, this stopping once every 7 serves as sort of this great equalizer in Israel. It provides a way for people to understand how they should relate to those lower than them on the social hierarchy. They remember. So, what do we do then with the Sabbath? Do we really have to stop every 7 days? Well, I think it might just help us to think about what happens in the New Testament. As I read the Gospels, Jesus and the disciples rest. In fact, I think they Sabbathed. They stopped once every 7 days and observed the Sabbath. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't love to choose this day as the day on which he might annoy the religious leaders. However, it doesn't mean that he totally discarded the day, that he got rid of it altogether. In fact, his interest seems to be in redeeming the Sabbath day from the abuses that it had seen, right? The Son of Man came to redeem the Sabbath, it seems. The Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. So let's put the Sabbath back in its rightful place. So what does this mean for our Sabbath observance? Well, as I continue to read the New Testament, I come to passages like Romans 14, 4 and 5, and Colossians 2:16. And these texts, Paul seems to sort of warn the people against letting others judge them on the basis of a certain day. And he even includes in some of those, in the Colossians text, he even says, and on the basis of a Sabbath. So what are we supposed to do with this? I think it's important to note exactly the language of what Paul says. He says, don't let anyone judge you. In fact, the days he lists sound a lot like other lists we get several times throughout the Old Testament, like Isaiah chapter 1, when God's angry with the people and he says, I've had enough of your new moon festivals and your Sabbaths and your feasts. That sounds like what Paul is saying. And I think what Paul is saying is listen, don't let anyone judge you. Don't let those people who think that by somehow stopping once a day, they're suddenly becoming more holy, or stopping once a day, they're somehow better than you. Don't let anyone judge you on the basis of a day. I don't think Paul discards the Sabbath. I think, again, he's trying to redeem the Sabbath, trying to help people understand the way that Sabbath was really intended to be observed. So for us, what do we do with this? Well, I'm not going to tell you exactly what your Sabbath observance has to look like, but I do think this. I do think the biblical text sets before us this gift. Would you be interested in stopping and resting and allowing God to do his good work within you? So maybe for you, that Sabbath observance needs to look like stopping for 24 hours a day, for 24 hours, one full day, at least once a week. Maybe if you've never done that before, that needs to be how you shema this word, how you listen to the word and put it into practice within your life. Maybe for you, instead, it needs to be just stopping to remember your salvation. That's part of the purpose of the Sabbath, right? Is that you might remember how God rescued you from the hand of slavery. Salvation is just as real for you as it was for the Israelites who came out of the land of Egypt. So will you allow this day to help you remember where God has led you from? And maybe, just maybe, as we New Testament Christians begin to understand what God has to say into our world, we could begin to practice this idea that we rest. And maybe this act of rest actually can do something in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Listen, I'm not going to tell you exactly how you have to observe the Sabbath, but I am convinced about this. I think Sabbath rest is one of the most redemptive, restorative, countercultural, subversive acts of resistance that a Christian today can practice. And so I encourage you, guard the Sabbath.